I believe I've mentioned this before in another video, but part of the reason I got into linguistics in the first place was because when I was a wee weeb reading manga scanlations online, I grew interested in the characters in the background, because there were so many different letters in use. From this, I started studying Japanese and learned that Japanese was composed of 3 distinct but deeply related scripts. 2 of these scripts are syllabaries called kana, meaning borrowed character. Remember that for later, it's important. Both of the scripts, as a category of syllabary implies, represent syllables, though in Japanese they actually represent a unit called a mora. But the name morari doesn't exist, so syllabary works just well enough. Either way, the more rounded, loopy one is known as hiragana, meaning smooth kana, while the angular set is known as katakana, meaning partial kana. Again, remember these name translations, as they are important for later. Finally, the last scripts in use are kanji, meaning Chinese character. These don't represent sounds generally, but instead represent semantic meaning. I won't go too deep into the structure of kanji in this video, as I've done that previously, but the basic gist is that, for example, this character would represent person, this character would represent anti, and this character would represent the nasal twang in speech caused by having one's nose clogged. Okay, that last one isn't really used in Japanese, though it does see some marginal use in Chinese apparently, as it's part of the PRC's list of commonly used standard Chinese characters. So Japanese has 3 scripts, and instead of, say, Uzbek, where the 3 different scripts are generally used independently of one another, Japanese opts to use all 3 at the same time. Kanji is generally used for large, semantically heavy native and Sino-Japanese words, while hiragana is used for native words without kanji, as well as alongside certain kanji to disambiguate their reading or to inflect words. Finally, katakana is used to represent foreign loanwords, as a type of italics to draw attention, or in scientific writing for animal and plant species. Though those last 2 examples aren't really shown here as they aren't the easiest to weave into a simple example sentence. But isn't that interesting? 3 scripts, with one being a logographic representation and the other 2 being phonetic representations of the language. Well, almost phonetic. The characters ha and he change pronunciation to wa and e when used as particles, and wo is almost always pronounced as o outside of careful speech. But be that as it may, the question still stands. Why is Japanese spelled in this mixed script style? Japan probably first encountered writing during the late Yayoi period of Japan, as diplomatic relations between Japan and China started. The earliest evidence of writing in Japan we have is of the Kanno wa no nan no kokuo-in, or the King of Na's gold seal, from the middle of the 1st century AD. This seal was gifted to a Na Kingdom emissary by Emperor Guangwu of the Eastern Han Empire. The 5 letters of the golden seal spell out Kanno wa no nano kokuo in Chinese seal script. However, despite this and other examples of Chinese writing in Japan, such as various coins and mirrors, the Japanese themselves didn't adopt writing, instead seeing it as a more decorative aspect. It wasn't until the 5th century that the Japanese began to adopt writing in the form of classical Chinese from the Baekje Kingdom on the Korean peninsula. Yep, when the Japanese learned to write, they learned to write classical Chinese from Korean scholars to record Japanese history and government. To give you a better idea of what this was like, the Nihon Shoki, the 2nd earliest known piece of literature written by a Japanese author and possibly one of the most foundational pieces of Japanese literature, as it discusses the history of Japan until the Nara period and sets the entire foundation that is a Japanese imperial family's claim to the throne in mythological origin. That Nihon Shoki was written entirely in classical Chinese. Its predecessor, the Kojiki, a more reduced form of the stories, was also written in classical Chinese, though this form was modified in slight ways to represent the Japanese language to a lesser extent. For example, this verse from the Kojiki, where the character mi is used to represent the Japanese polite prefix mi. This writing in classical Chinese, called kanbun, was the main way to write within Japanese court and in religious contexts, which makes sense as kanbun came to Japan alongside Buddhism and Confucianism, and many Buddhist texts in East Asia were written in classical Chinese, if not Sanskrit. Despite this prevalence of classical Chinese, people still really wanted to write their own language down. Out of this desire came kana, or the usage of Chinese characters for the sound value instead of the semantic meaning. Now the translation of borrowed character makes a bit more sense, doesn't it? With kana, one would generally write out Japanese phonetically, using the pronunciation of certain characters, regardless of their inherent meaning. There was some consistency in the characters used, as can be seen with this poem from the Kojiki, where this character was consistently used for ya, and this character was consistently used for the sound tu, and so on. But any character could be used as long as it sounded similar enough to the Japanese syllable, as can be seen from this poem from the Manyoshu. Though this poem also exhibits another feature of kana, which is to retain certain characters for their meaning, just read with their Japanese equivalents. Sometimes you'd have a word written twice, once with a semantic character and once with a phonetic spelling, such as moti here. Nowadays, a style of kana with full characters is called manyō-gana, after the Manyoshu, the oldest collection of written Japanese poetry written almost entirely in manyō-gana. These two styles of writing were the main ways of writing Old Japanese. However, as the Nara period moved on to the Heian period around the 8th century, and the language of Old Japanese changed into that of early Middle Japanese, so too did the writing evolve. Kanbun and manyō-gana were still used, but new ways to write based on them had slowly started to develop. Perhaps the most well-known of these methods outside of Japan is that of manyō-gana becoming more cursive over time until it was recognized as a different script. This script went by a couple of names, with Sōgana, cursive script, being popular due to its cursive-connected nature, and Onnade being popular as the script was generally used by women of the court in poetry. Today the script is known as hiragana, or at least an extremely early form of it. Like manyō-gana before it, this script was mainly phonetic, with characters representing syllabic units instead of semantic ones. And as mentioned previously, this script was mainly used in poetry, but it was also used in personal diaries and communications. Perhaps one of the most well-known poets to use this early form of hiragana was Murasaki Shikibu, or Lady Murasaki, who authored the Tale of Genji. The example on screen sadly isn't the Tale of Genji, but actually from a diary. But it still shows just how insane this cursive script actually was. It also shows that kanji was still in use in this style of writing to an extent, but the majority of the script was kana in nature. Also, unlike the name of woman script, a fair number of men also use a script in their personal life. Though outside of that, they were generally expected to use manyō-gana or kanbun. Speaking of kanbun, some interesting developments also occurred there. See, the court officials and Buddhist monks would read and write in kanbun, but when reading the text aloud or when speaking, they would use Japanese. This practice of reading and writing one thing, but saying another was quite laborious, especially when the two languages were as distinct as classical Chinese, with its analytic grammar and monosyllabic words, and Middle Japanese, with its highly agglutinative grammar and multisyllabic words. To ease this task, Buddhist monks and government officials began to annotate the text. Said annotations can be seen here from a Heian period sutra. They may be kind of hard to see here, but the little black marks are annotations. But how exactly did these annotations work? Well, there are several levels of annotations that could be used. The first and most common was the kairiten, or the returning marks. These were little marks used to help the reader mentally rearrange the order of the words. The simplest form of this is the reiten, or remark, which indicates that two characters are swapped from Chinese to Japanese. Then there are the ichi-ni-ten, or 1-2 marks. These designate 1 as the starting point, and then going in growing order, from 1 to 3, they drag the other words after that 1. If even that isn't enough, then there are 3 more layers that one can use with similar functionality to ichi-ni-ten. The joge-ten, with up, down, and middle. The go-tsu-ten, which uses the characters of the 10 heavenly stems, a kind of ordinal system used in much of the sinosphere. And finally, the tenshi-ten, which uses the concept of heaven, earth, and the human used in Eastern philosophy. According to a kanbun textbook I found, rarely are all 4 sets ever used. But this text from a 9th century letter is a common example of all of them in use at once. The other type of annotation used, often in conjunction with the kairi-ten, are the reading inflectional marks. These were originally kanji with pronunciations that were familiar to the author, that were used to mark the pronunciation of a character or the inflection of a word in the main text. Over time, only part of the kana was used, and this gave rise to katakana. This can be seen in this Heian period sutra from earlier, and here's an example with full marking in practice. Remember, this part is all that's written. This is just how people would read it aloud. Either way, these kana in conjunction with the kairi-ten were very useful in marking classical Chinese. The katakana specifically was so useful, in fact, that it actually gave rise to a semi-new way of writing Japanese itself, instead of just annotating kanbun, which can be found in the form of setsuwa poetry. In this text from the Kamakura period, we can see this with the matured katakana system being used to show pronunciation of certain words, and to show the inflectional endings of others. What's most important, though, is that it's representing Japanese in a similar way to hiragana writing, just with a wee bit more kanji. Now at this point you might be thinking, okay, so Manyogana was created, and that quickly became the basis for modern Japanese orthography, and katakana, which was used in bureaucracy and religion, was relegated to technical and eventually loanwords, and kanbun and Manyogana were quickly abandoned, right? Nope! Because from the end of the Heian period, all the way to the Meiji Restoration, all four systems were in use. Kanbun remained in literary and official use, as well as in international relations with China and Korea. Kanji and katakana mixed script was used in governmental cases, literature, science, and so on. Kanji hiragana mixed script was used in personal correspondence, poetry, and literature. And Manyogana also saw limited use throughout the period. So for almost a millennium, Japan had 4 different but concurrent ways to write, with each seeing varying amounts of popularity as time went on. One method was for a different language, while the other 3 were methods of writing the same language. What's worse still is that by the Edo period, the spoken language had once again changed, but this time, the written language of the Heian period, when these methods of writing were devised, hadn't. This variety became known as Classical Japanese, and at this point would be like if English speakers today had to learn to read and write in the style of the Canterbury Tales. Sure, it's doable, but it's a pain in the butt to learn, and people in the Meiji period definitely thought so as well. So starting in the late 1800s, certain authors began to write in a modern style of Japanese using kanji hiragana mixed script in a movement called Genbunichi. The movement's goal, as the name implied, was to bring speech and writing into one standardized form. This movement gained enough steam that the Meiji government would not only standardize the list of kana used in writing, but by the 1920s promoted their modern variety to the point that almost all printed materials were in modern Japanese, using kanji hiragana mixed script. Government documents, however, would remain in classical Japanese with kanji katakana mixed script, though modern Japanese would be used at times in the military and in lower-end bureaucracy, but still with katakana. However, due to a certain conservative mindset, quite a bit of etymological spelling of kana remained, so the word kyo would be written as kefu in kana, and the declarative ending masho was written as maseiyu. That last example can actually be seen in this piece of Japanese propaganda against the perm hairstyle. Now this is finally starting to look quite similar to the system that Japanese is currently written in. However, katakana and hiragana are still mostly used separately. So how is it that katakana lost the ability to represent the grammatical parts of the language, and was relegated to loanwords and scientific terms? The answer to that can be seen in 1945 when Japan lost World War II and once again decided to reform their writing system. In this reform, a list of official kanji for document use was created as well as simplified in a process known as shinjitai, which, if you've caught one of my Sunday office hours streams, you know my feelings on. And hiragana was updated to lose its historical orthography and better represent pronunciation, and also spread into usage in government documents. And katakana? Katakana was foregone by the government due to its association with the military and wartime government of World War II. However, as we know, it didn't disappear. That is because back when trade with the West was going on in the Edo period, and new concepts such as glass tobacco and coffee were coming into the country starting in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Japanese had one of 3 methods to naming them. The first was to calque them, the second was to coin a new term, and the third was to borrow the word but to give it a kanji spelling. In the latter case, because these would be in scientific or official documents, katakana would be used to gloss them for their reading. Katakana was also used in dictionaries at the time as phonetic guides on how to pronounce certain words, a tradition that may have derived from katakana's original purpose of transcribing Buddhist and Chinese texts. This example is a wee bit pixelated, but the main entries are in hiragana, and when the pronunciation is different than the spelling, small katakana is put to the side. Both of these methods, from what I have gathered, seem to have given rise to the modern usage of using katakana for loanwords and scientific terms. And there is an overly simplified history of the Japanese writing system. Now obviously there are so many more little details hidden in the cracks that I didn't cover, such as how at times the line between Chinese writing and Japanese writing seems to have blurred. But these are the large overarching strokes that one should know. Thank you to my friend Kat for helping me find the examples throughout this video, and thank you to my patron Max. And until next time, I bid you all adieu.